All right. Thank you very much for continuing with us. We've got a great program for this afternoon as well. We have two fantastic panels, starting off with this one that will be moderated and facilitated by Alan Bersin. So I'll let him talk to you and introduce the other folks on the panel. But let me just say we're delighted to have Alan Bersin here as a global fellow since he's left government. He's been working with us as well as some other projects that he's been working on. But we're really, really delighted to have him working with us on our border issues and on North American regional competitiveness and cooperation issues. As you all know, he's someone who has a very long trajectory and a very high quality trajectory working on U.S. Mexico border issues from the San Diego area, and had several regional positions in California and San Diego before he came out to Washington, led Customs and Border Protection, CBP here in Washington, was Assistant Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security in charge of international affairs and policy planning for some time as well. Has really had his hand in most of the innovative projects that have happened along the U.S.-Mexico border for about the last 20 years. And so thanks very much for being here, for working with us at the Mexico Institute, and for doing us this honor of running this panel today.
Thank you, Chris. Always pleased to be at the Wilson Center, and particularly pleased to do it now for the first time in the NGO sector. Thank you for that gracious introduction. Before introducing the panel and the discussion, I've been asked to make an announcement by the Institute, which is that on July 27th and 28th in San Diego at the Hilton beachfront, there is going to be a meeting of the U.S.-Mexican border mayors. This was an organization established a number of years ago that proposition is to have border mayors express the view of los fronterizos, the borderlanders, with regard to U.S.-Mexican relations. And Mayor Faulkner is sponsoring or hosting the meeting this year, and the Wilson Center has played an important role in acting as the secretariat, so to speak, of the association. So those of you who can make it should. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel, and we are fortunate to have on a discussion of infrastructure and cross-border trade, particularly at this juncture, two chief executive officers of large transportation companies. And when I say large, I mean large. And we have Derek Leathers from Werner Enterprises, which is one of the large cross-border and national trucking companies operating in the North American space. And we have Patrick Ottensmeyer, who is the President, Chief Executive Officer of Kansas City Southern Railway Company, one of the major rail companies in this country, and also one of the key players in the cross-border scene between Mexico and the United States. And we have two CEOs would never be comfortable without a regulator in place. We have the border coordinator from the Department of State, Hillary Quam, who joins us today to discuss border infrastructure. And as you will learn, she has a fair amount to say. What I'd like to do is actually provide each of our panelists with an opportunity, several minutes, to make an introductory series of comments, and then ask some questions of them, and then with 10 to 12 minutes left, turn the floor over to the audience. But preliminarily, let me say that we think of infrastructure usually in the U.S.-Mexico context as being the 46, 47 land ports of entry that are part of the 327 airports, seaports, and land ports that actually are the gateway in and out of the United States and to Mexico and to Canada. And there's a certain amount of bricks and mortar involved in this, big infrastructure, which both of these CEOs are used to, and Hillary knows from her permitting activities. But I think we want to think about infrastructure also as that invisible set of arrangements that actually govern the movement across borders of these massive flows of goods, people, merchandise that happens now in the North American space to the amount of $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion a year in terms of North American trade. And the bulk of that trade is actually carried across the border by truck or by rail. And we need to see attention to both forms of infrastructure, the very physical bricks and mortar infrastructure, as well as the invisible arrangements that interact with that physical infrastructure to produce either a fluid flow or else one that involves inordinate and very costly wait times. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to Mr. Ottensmeyer first. We'll move from your right to left and provide each of our panelists with an opportunity of 7 to 10 minutes, depending on their choice.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My involvement and familiarity with the Wilson Institute is relatively new, but I have been very impressed with the quality of the research and the data and the and the people and the programs. And it's particularly with Chris and Duncan, the Mexico Institute. I think I'm actually going to be joining one of your partners in Mexico City next week at another conference. So I'm spending more time at conferences and in Washington than thank God I got a great team back in Kansas City. I don't have to worry about running the railroad. But for those of you who don't know us, we are one of the large Class 1 railroads in North America. We're the 7th largest railroad in North America. But importantly, we are one of the 2 largest in Mexico. We actually own a railroad in Mexico. We are the only North American railroad that has control and ownership of a railroad in Mexico. And the railroad in Mexico happens to go over the busiest border crossing between the 2 countries, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, and then down through Monterrey into the heart of Mexico, San Luis Potosí, Querétaro, down to Mexico City, and then out to the ports of Lázaro Cárdenas on the Pacific side, Veracruz, Tampico, Altamira, and Matamoros on the Gulf side. We once branded ourselves the NAFTA Railroad. Mexico is so important to us, and you see that most of us executive officers wear the Mexican and U.S. flag. I've worn this lapel pin in the West Wing in the Eisenhower building, and if I have the opportunity to go in the Oval Office, I'll be wearing this lapel pin on my coat. Mexico is very important to us. It's very important to our customers, and we think our railroad is actually a very important ingredient connecting supply chains in North America. You may be surprised to learn that if you look at our cross-border traffic, which represents about 40% of our total business moves to and from Mexico, more than 60% of that is southbound. 60% of our traffic is export business freight moving from the United States into Mexico. Our largest single cross-border commodity by a large margin is grain. So again, this is not a map of our rail system, but if you can visualize a railroad that on the north touches St. Louis and Kansas City, and then down through Louisiana, Houston, across Laredo, and then down into the major industrial markets and population centers in Mexico, that is a perfect pipeline, if you will, for U.S. corn grown in Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Illinois, and other ag products in Kansas and other Midwestern states. A very efficient pipeline moving those products from the heartland of the United States down into one of the largest grain importing regions in the world, which happens to be in central Mexico. Mexico is the second largest importer of corn in the world, and our railroad, depending on the year, moves about 35 to 40% of all corn moved into Mexico moves on our railroad. So our largest cross-border commodity today is corn and grain, and two of our largest cross-border opportunities for the years ahead, and this is a message that we have made consistently to lawmakers and policymakers on both sides of the border, are also export from the U.S. to Mexico. And those are refined petroleum products moving from the U.S. Gulf Coast into Mexico. As Mexico has deregulated and opened its energy markets to foreign investment and competition for Pemex, they desperately need refined products, and the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are very happy to get into that market, and we think that that is going to be an enormous market. And we're investing our own money to build the facilities in central Mexico where there is a lack of pipeline capacity and a need for these products, and all the way down into Mexico City. So we see that as a very large source of or solution, if you will, to the trade deficit between the U.S. and Mexico that is real and is near term. The second large opportunity is also energy related, and that's plastic pellets. There are a dozen or so or more, I think the total is $165 billion being invested, mostly in the U.S. Gulf Coast, to build these ethane and ethylene refineries. That is driven by the abundant supply and low cost of natural gas in the United States. And a lot of those products are going to go to Mexico to support consumption, consumer products, industrial, and manufacturing growth in Mexico. So it's obviously it's very important. Any way you look at our company, we are 50% Mexico. 50% of our track miles, revenues, carloads, employees are in Mexico. And if you understand how important railroads are to economies and to industrial economies, we're very significant, very important player in Mexico, not just for cross-border, but moving products throughout the country, from the ports into the center of the country. And there's no question that a lot of the foreign investment that has taken place in Mexico over the last 10 to 20 years has been because of the infrastructure, the proximity to North America and particularly the U.S., but infrastructure. All those auto plants that have been built in Mexico and other industrial activity wouldn't be possible if you didn't have very efficient infrastructure, highways, toll roads, ports, and railways to move those products into the natural markets. We operate in the United States in 10 states, and in each of the 10 states, trade with Mexico is either number one or number two. So as you can imagine, we've been quite vocal. I've spent more time in Washington than I ever expected I would. When I became CEO last July, and certainly after the election, things got pretty hectic. But and it's not just because it's important to us and our company. It's important to our customers. It's important to the communities. And the map up here, the one slide that Chris allowed me to show here, was one that we believe was part of the discussion after President Trump signed an executive order a few weeks ago or months ago announcing that he intended to pull out of NAFTA, to just really illustrate and put a bit of a different spin, if you will, on how important trade was to the heartland of America. Because when you look at a map that shows the number of jobs, in the state that are tied to trade or tied to NAFTA in particular, or tied to Mexico, the numbers don't just hit you over the head in some cases, because in a state like Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa, just the number is not going to stand out on the page as it would in California or Texas or Arizona. But what this map shows, and it doesn't quite easy to show, but the it shows by county the percent of GDP that is tied to trade. And so it may only be a few hundred jobs, but in a lot of these rural counties, it's 50% of the economy. And so when you kind of put it in that context and you realize how devastated a lot of these counties and states would be if you significantly shrunk international trade and specifically NAFTA and trade with Mexico, it puts a little different light on the story. So we feel that things are moving in a positive direction as the new policymakers and lawmakers become more focused on this. I mentioned at lunch the letter as Ambassador Lighthizer was taking his hand off the Bible. There was a letter in his palm from 18 U.S. senators talking about the importance of NAFTA and the desire to reach a good outcome. There was a letter signed by 32 CEOs expressing the same thing. We're hoping that the governors as a group step up and show support. I know they're individually doing that, but certainly encouraging anyone and everyone who has a voice at the table to just really understand what's at stake here, and the importance not only for the economy but for the communities, on both sides of the border, just for regional stability. There is a presidential election in Mexico next year, and there are certainly, I asked the question earlier today, but if the outcome of the renegotiation of NAFTA is not done carefully and thoughtfully to preserve the benefits on both sides of the border, all three sides, you could end up with an outcome in that election that would make things even more interesting than they are today. So as far as trade, I'll take just another couple of minutes. As far as border crossing, Kevin mentioned it earlier in his comments, and he was right. The way a train crosses the border, whether it's northbound or southbound, it pulls up to the yellow stripe on the track that indicates the border, and the train stops and the crew gets off. And if it's a Mexican crew, if it's a northbound train, they walk back to their base in Nuevo Laredo, and then the American crew walks out to the middle of the bridge, gets on the train, and then takes it away. So that train is probably sitting there, if it's a 10,000-foot train, probably blocking dozens of crossings in Nuevo Laredo or Laredo, Texas. It's subject to theft and vandalism. It's a nuisance in the community, and it's just an enormous source of inefficiency and delay. There are major rail classification yards within 10 miles of the border. On the Mexican side, there are yards, and on the U.S. side, it's Union Pacific and our own yard in Laredo, Texas, that are much, much better places to handle that activity. So Alan was very critical in getting us to get some momentum around some projects that we're continuing to work on with law enforcement, Border Patrol, Customs, labor, a lot of people at the table, so to speak, to get this done. But we're making progress, and we're hopeful that in the near future we will be able to run that train at 30 miles an hour across the bridge. The crew change will take place in one of those yards that are well equipped to park the train and service the train, and that activity takes place there anyhow. And through processes and technology, we could double or triple the capacity at the bridge. It's a single track bridge. Bridges cost a lot of money, and they are very expensive, and we're talking about international bridges. They're very difficult to get permitted. It may not even be feasible given the congestion in that area. So really the solution is to use technology, information sharing, and change the processes at the border to improve the way commerce is done and trains move across the border, because we're going to need the capacity to move the products that want to move and increase exports from the U.S. to Mexico. So with that, I think I will stop, and allow
Thank you,
the
Mr.
other panelists.
Ottensmeyer. That very helpful introduction. Mr. Leathers.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here today. It's an exciting time with everything going on with NAFTA to be able to come and speak in front of a group like this. A little bit about my background. I've been doing business and really focused my career for most of its entirety on business with Mexico. In 1993, I was actually based out of Mexico City running a Mexican trucking company, and at the time, to my knowledge, I was the only U.S. citizen doing that inside the country of Mexico. It was a domestic trucking company operating out of Cuautitlán Izcalli, which is just north of Mexico City. So I lived through NAFTA and when it was being implemented, when it was being negotiated. I find it ironic today on the news, whenever you listen to any news reports and U.S. folks complaining about NAFTA, I can tell you it was not a party in Mexico in 1994 either. There were lots of concerns about the outcomes that may take place. But I've also been able to grow up with it and grow up through it. And so from there, I went on and became vice president of Mexico for Schneider National, a large trucking company that did business to and from Mexico, and then ultimately came to Werner in 1999 to start their Mexico division. Our commitment to Mexico has been significant since that time, and was able to grow up through the ranks and now am fortunate enough to be the president and CEO at Werner Enterprises. A little background on Werner. So we're a $2.2 billion transportation and logistics company. Our roots are in trucking. We started the old-fashioned way with one truck. Our founder dropped out of high school to start the company. But from that one truck and those very humble beginnings, we now operate a multi-billion-dollar operation that includes both trucking, logistics, freight forwarding, brokerage, U.S. Customs broker, kind of the whole suite of services that our customers look for, including intermodal, and do business with all of the Class I railroads. As we think about our commitment to Mexico and what it represents in our network, it's the fastest growing piece of our business and has been since 1999. So every year since 99, it's been the fastest single growing piece. It now represents 27% of all revenues at Werner within our truckload operation, our over-the-road truckload, and 15% of total revenues, and growing quickly. Inside of Mexico, over time, we've basically developed a scaled-down, smaller version of the parent company. So we both do, we do trucking, we do cross-border, but we also do freight forwarding from Mexico to Latin America, Mexico to Asia, as we do in the U.S. to Asia, Latin America, and Mexico. Canada is a presence for us as well, so we do business on both borders, but with a significantly larger focus in our network on Mexico. What's interesting is for us is we've grown from those humble beginnings to be the largest cross-border carrier to and from Mexico today. So we will cross this year, depending on how the year turns out, somewhere north of 140,000 loads, and we believe when the final tally comes in, it'll be closer to 150,000 loads this year with the country of Mexico alone. What makes that more interesting and remarkable, we believe, is we've done all of that without participating in the automotive sector. So some might call us crazy because we're working pretty hard to get that kind of volume when none of it is really going after the biggest industry that exists. A lot of reasons for that, but we believed heavily in a diversified strategy. We wanted to have no one customer represent too big of our mix, and we wanted to really focus on sort of that elite service, higher expectation, just-in-time world, but outside of the volume and maybe said differently, volume fluctuations that happen within automotive. When we talk about the panel today and we talk about questions about the border and delays at the border, you know, for me it's an interesting perspective because it's hard to disconnect in my mind what 1993 looked like versus where we are today, meaning how much progress we've made, because it's unbelievably efficient on one hand compared to what we had back in 93, 94, 95. And I remember celebrating days when we could get loads crossed in 24 hours and being excited if we could do that consistently. So where we're at today is a heck of a lot better than that, and I think we should kind of smell the roses and realize our progress. But the flip side is something that hit me recently is there's an organization called ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute. They just completed their 2016 congestion study, and it's a domestic U.S. congestion study. And they estimate that congestion is costing domestic trucking about $65 billion a year in lost opportunity, lost productivity because of slowdowns at congested links in the U.S. interstate system. The average mile per hour in those congested interstate linkages is about 17 miles an hour. I think we all know we're not averaging 17 miles an hour at the border. And so my point being, we don't have that study. I don't have it. Maybe it exists. Maybe the Wilson Center has it. But I think the untold billions of lost productivity and lost opportunity is something that we have to continue to chip away at. And where it plays out in real life is, if you think about it, sitting in my seat, leading a publicly traded on NASDAQ, $2 billion operation, we're asking tough questions right now about, can we allow our Mexico business to grow much further? Because as we sit here today with 27% of our truckload business being to and from Mexico, there becomes a point where that is onerous enough with the interruptions that can take place, with a tornado that can hit a building and stop traffic or cut traffic in half for a matter of days, that we can't afford too much of a percentage. Well, the business side of me says, well, that's crazy talk. I mean, this is good business. It's growing business. It's integral to who we are. It's culturally who we are. We're the only U.S. trucking company that I'm aware of, at least, that has a president and CEO who has lived and grown up within Mexico versus the U.S. side, and now finds himself leading a U.S. trucking operation. So we want to leverage that every chance we can. But what people underestimate when we have these outages at the border, if you're in our network, and if you could track trucks over the following 7 days, a small half-day, slowdown at the border, when 27% of your business is going and getting caught in that slowdown, will take us 7 to 10 days to work those kinks back out of our network. And that effect, that accordion effect, extends all the way to the PNW, all the way to the Northeast when it happens. And so the disruption is much more significant than just what happens at the border. So the perspective, hopefully, I could bring today is to focus. You got a lot of experts that live and breathe at the border every day that know it better than I do. But our perspective is more kind of the rest of the story and how that impact goes far beyond the border. Thoughts, as I prepared for today, things that I hope we can continue to double down on is our commitment to technology investment on both sides, our commitment to interagency cooperation on both sides. The days of needing to have multiple inspections from multiple different agencies have to be something that we talk about and joke about and laugh about having needed to be once upon a time versus an integrated inspection approach that we're getting closer to every day. Technology, you look at our fleet, so we have 24,800 trailers in our fleet. They're all satellite equipped. Well, there's a handful that aren't, that are being sold in the next 6 months. They have door open, door closed sensors, loaded, unloaded sensors, freight shifting sensors. I mean, we know what happens inside that trailer irrefutably anywhere in Mexico, anywhere in the U.S., anywhere that trailer goes. How do we link those systems better? How do we take advantage of that technology? Why try to reinvent the wheel on some of this when private practice technology or private industry is already invested in it? So there's an opportunity there. The southbound, northbound imbalance, Pat talked about 60% of their volumes, if I heard correctly, are southbound. Well, obviously, by the nature of needing a trailer, we have to be balanced, but the demand imbalance is about 60% northbound for us. So we have way more demand coming out of Mexico every day than we can fund trailers into Mexico. And we're doing everything we can to, whether it be sending them empty or finding creative products to haul or new things that are opportunities for U.S. exporters. But over time, that imbalance year over year has gotten a little worse. But it's not what they say in the news. It's not because we're not exporting things. It's not because they're not buying products. It's the simple reality of taking raw materials in that fit tightly in a trailer and taking finished goods out that are much more voluminous in terms of how they cube and how they cube those same trailers out. And so it's a problem that's ongoing. Intermodal is part of the solution, our ability to find creative southbound. But over time, we now in our business, it's interesting, but we have sort of redefined the border. So from a dispatch perspective, in order to fund equipment into Mexico, as we think about dispatching these 7,300 trucks every day, Houston is essentially dispatched as part of our Mexico operation. San Antonio is dispatched as part of Mexico. Phoenix is dispatched as part of Mexico because it's so close to the border and I need those assets the second they're empty that we then send them into the interior so we can reload them out. So it's a changing world, at all the time. The other big change that's happening that I'm just not sure we're all ready for is the voluminous change in agricultural products coming out of Mexico, so produce in particular. With everything going on in California, we've seen a tremendous shift. And when I say tremendous, I'm talking 200 to 300% shift in volumes coming out of Mexico on our temperature-controlled assets. And our ability to try to keep pace with that has been nothing short of, impossible, really. We've been reshifting assets, buying more trailers, buying more equipment, trying to keep up with it. But this stuff is particularly fragile. So when we have, as one example, an account where we have to get produce out of the field and the clock starts when they cut it, and it's got to be into the Northeast 72 hours later. And they're not looking for excuses, and they're not interested in why it didn't get there, because if it doesn't get there, it's essentially useless upon arrival. And so those are the type of supply chain problems we're trying to solve for today that would have been a pipe dream 10 to 15 years ago, but they're within our line of sight. And on good days, we're pulling that off. And we're pulling that off to the tune of, hundreds, 300 loads a day in Laredo alone as an example. So we have the ability to do it, but it takes perfect coordination, and we're not perfect every day across all our different operating groups, whether that's our Mexican carrier partners, whether it's the border infrastructure itself, whether it's the need for fast lanes or lanes for sort of high frequency users, whatever the case may be. We got to continue to find a way to get these products to their final market. And then on NAFTA, I would echo Pat's sentiment. I believe that anything that's as old as NAFTA is, we have to accept the reality that there's probably some things that it's time to relook at. We would never hold on to a lease for 20 years. We wouldn't hold on to a business contract for 20 years. We wouldn't hold on to anything for 20 years without relooking at it and rediscussing it. So that's something I find appropriate. What's inappropriate is some of the dialogue and some of the rhetoric and some of the sensationalism around it. And what we need to do is just clean it up. Find areas where there's some improvements to be made, but I think it's truly a matter of a remodel, not a tear down. And so we don't need to tear it down and build it anew. We just have some remodeling to do. I think the business community on the U.S. side has to take a strong stance. We are taking that same strong stance as Pat and others. It's not popular at times for us to take a strong stance on our support of NAFTA, but all the numbers are irrefutable. The trade gap with China has exponentially grown over the same period of time since NAFTA has been in place with Mexico and Canada, and we didn't have a trade agreement with them in that period. Our imports or our exports to Mexico have grown exponentially over that same time frame, whereas with China they have not. So we have other issues out there. And this idea that with or without NAFTA, some of these jobs and some of these manufacturing opportunities wouldn't have shifted to a quality, low-cost labor force that's geographically positioned, at our southern border, I think is somewhat ludicrous. I mean, those operations would have went there. What's perhaps more concerning is those that believe if we were to bring all those jobs back and build all those plants again, that they wouldn't be led by robotics day one, that they wouldn't be built and constructed in a new modern paradigm, and you would not be all of a sudden shifting 5 million jobs back into the United States. I think the Wilson Center's own estimate said something like net of all job transfers, if you were to try to replace, repick up, and reestablish, you're probably net down about 4 million jobs, because the number of people that are supporting those primary products that go into the value-added operation in Mexico to then be re-exported to the U.S. So we're pro-NAFTA. We're pro both Canadian and U.S. border improvements. We're proud of the improvements they have made. And I think sometimes if you work in the government, you probably are underappreciated for the steps they've taken and the improvements they've made, because I can tell you from experience, it's a heck of a lot better than it was back in 1995. But we still have work to do. And so we want to be part of that solution, part of the dialogue, and be hopefully able to make some recommendations that make sense over time.
Thank you, Mr. Leathers. Very insightful introduction as well. Ms. Plum, Border Coordinator for the Department of State.
Yes. Yes, so I am the U.S. Mexico Border Coordinator in the Office of Mexican Affairs at the Department of State. Is that better? Okay. Well, I just want to start by echoing the thanks both to the Wilson Center and to the Border Trade Alliance for organizing the conference here today. As evidenced by the participation and just the interest, these are extremely important issues. And I think one of the unique pieces for me, of course, coming from the State Department, is these are issues that affect the day-to-day lives of people and our day-to-day activities. a lot of times at the Department of State, we do a lot of high-level 20,000-foot type thinking, discussing, very policy-oriented, whereas while we do all of those things related to border issues and border infrastructure as well, there's a real tangible element to it, and a domestic piece as well that's different for us, what we normally do at the State Department, and I think that's really rewarding. But you can see how you're making changes. What I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about the State Department's role in border infrastructure issues. And I'm going to highlight a couple projects that we have going on right now and a few of the mechanisms that we use to be able to coordinate these issues, both with the constituencies along the border, but also the binational coordination that we do with the government of Mexico. A large part of what we do is the coordination piece. And we have a handful of mechanisms through which we do that. One of the longest standing is the Binational Bridges and Border Crossings Group. It's been in existence for about 30 years now. An extremely valuable mechanism for both us here in the United States and I believe for Mexico as well, to be able to coordinate on really the issues related to ports of entry in particular, where we're going to build new ports of entry, any issues that are going on at them. We, to a certain extent, get into the access to and from those ports of entry as well. And one of the really unique aspects of the Binational Bridges and Border Crossings Group is that every meeting, we have one plenary meeting each year where we look at all crossings along the entire U.S. southern border. And we do 2 regional meetings as well that are generally somewhere on the border. Each meeting starts with a public session. And this is the opportunity for us to hear both from the people living in the area, from local officials, and also from industry about the issues that they're seeing here in these regions, about some of the problems that need to be addressed, about projects that they're going to propose to us coming forward in the future. And that's where we can really start the coordination, the state, local, and binational coordination on how to move these things forward and make the projects a reality, or how can we address some of the problems that are going on there. We just had the plenary meeting of the Binational Bridges and Border Crossings Group at the State Department at the end of May. And it was extremely useful for us in moving forward that we were able to coordinate because we had everybody in the room on some of the issues related to the recent tornado that's been mentioned a couple of times here. But also looking at some new projects, some potential new rail crossing projects, new ports of entry that states are looking at sponsoring along the border that will hopefully open up some more avenues both for commercial crossings and personal vehicle crossings. Taking it up to a slightly higher level, we also coordinate the Executive Steering Committee of the 21st Century Border Management Initiative. This was an initiative launched in 2010 to better align policies across the border between the U.S. and Mexico, both in the area of cross-border infrastructure, secure flows of goods and people, and also law enforcement and security-related issues, but all unique to the border itself. So we are actually in discussions now about how to move forward on that mechanism in particular. I think we are probably going to hold the next meeting of the Executive Steering Committee, which is the high-level meeting of that group, probably coming up in the next couple of months. With the transition, we had to wait a little while to get some of the top level mechanisms back in place and moving between our new administration here in the United States and establish the relationships with the government of Mexico. And now we're moving forward on getting some of these other dialogues in place as well. That I want to highlight also a large part of our coordination role in cross-border infrastructure is related to the fact that the State Department issues what are called presidential permits for any cross-border projects. Essentially, a presidential permit is needed for, we call it, any project that pierces the border. You need to have a presidential permit to be able to do that, and it's solely U.S. requirement, not from Mexico. They have their own permitting issues as well. But the State Department coordinates this process both for land ports of entry and water and petroleum pipelines. So there's been, I'm sure everyone has seen, there's been a lot of interest, and the issue of presidential permitting has gained profile related to Keystone. Luckily, that is run out of a different part of the State Department than what we do. But we are responsible for the permitting for all land ports of entry and water pipelines as well. And a big piece of what we're looking for in whether we're going to issue a permit or not is determining that the project is in the national interest. So we do this by coordinating with the other parts of the U.S. interagency, by seeking public comment as well on the projects, by coordinating with state and local officials, that how is this going to serve both the U.S. government, but also the broader U.S. interest. We've issued a handful of permits recently. I know there was some anxiety shortly after the administration change here that we might slow down on these, but we actually have been moving forward kind of business as usual. And we've recently issued a permit authorizing the Union Pacific Railroad Company to operate and maintain the Brownsville West Rail International Bypass. This was a big project for us, as it's the first new international rail crossing between the United States and Mexico since 1910. And it essentially moved the rail crossing from the center of Brownsville, Texas, outside, allowing for greater rail traffic and less congestion. We also, just a few weeks ago, issued a presidential permit to the state of Texas authorizing the construction of a new 2-lane bridge structure as part of the Presidio Ojinaga Bridge. Currently, southbound traffic is stopped daily for oversized trucks that are carrying manufactured homes from Ojinaga to a finishing facility in Presidio. About 1 to 4 homes cross daily. So with the new bridge, it will allow northbound and southbound traffic flows without having to stop traffic on either side to let the homes cross. And then finally, we also issued a permit just recently to the Otay Water District for a new cross-border water pipeline in the San Diego region. So these are just a couple examples of how the permitting process works. And I think I'll just close by highlighting a couple of the innovative projects that we've seen recently, and then perhaps move forward to questions. But one of the exciting projects that we've seen recently was the opening of the Cross-Border Express in the San Diego-Tijuana region. And for those who don't know or haven't seen it, it's a pedestrian footbridge that links the Tijuana International Airport with an airport terminal in San Diego. And passengers on both sides of the border can now walk across the border via footbridge, and they pass through customs and immigration just as in any U.S. or Mexican airport. And the innovative facility gives passengers on the U.S. side of the border a new way to access the Tijuana airport that has a large runway and expanded service throughout Latin America and Asia as well. And this was a project that really involved unprecedented collaboration between the government and business, a real public-private partnership that represents what we really see in as the future of border infrastructure projects, as our funds are becoming more limited and public-private partnerships demonstrate how we can modernize and work together to make improvements. I'd also highlight we have ongoing work at the San Ysidro Port of Entry. We recently completed the first of a 3-phase of the $740 million expansion of what is the largest port of entry in the United States. And it increased the port's vehicle capacity from 24 inspection booths to 46 booths. And related, in July of last year, we opened the pedestrian west facility there, allowing northbound travelers to cross through to the west side of the port of entry. So I think maybe I'll stop there and we can
Thank you, Ms. Quam. That's, we'll come back to some of those innovations, and I think the record will establish that I'm not usually lavish in my praise of the State Department, as Ambassador Wayne knows, but I will say that the State Department has been a critical partner in creating the kind of success that that Mr. Leathers indicated he's seen in the space of his career. We've got plenty of work to do, but the permitting, which used to be a 7 to 10 year process, is no longer that. But we'll come back to that. Let me ask Mr. Ottenmeyer. There are two dimensions to the infrastructure. There's the actual capacity of the bricks and mortar of the infrastructure to handle the issue, and then, as we pointed out, there's the invisible arrangements. So, as you contemplate what Ms. Quam just indicated, that we just did the first rail crossing in 110 years. Mm-hmm. It took a long time. That my friends from Texas will tell you, and the people who were involved in it, took a long time to make it happen. And this was a relatively minor adjustment in terms of bricks and mortar infrastructure for the roadbed. Compared to the issues that you were discussing in your opening on where the crews change and the kinds of arrangements that sometimes lead business people to scratch their heads, which do you think is, how would you assess the proportion of each of those to the wait time problem and to the need to improve to be able to get this flow of rail traffic moving, recognizing that I believe it's projected that 31% of cross-border trade over the next 20 years is expected to be in the rail area, which is good competition. I'm sure Mr. Leathers will indicate good competition for the trucking industry.
So let me just make sure I got your question. Just an understanding of how much of the congestion is driven by processes and procedures at the border versus physical infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
I would say the breakthrough that we could see near term, given, and I realize that permits, the permitting process, and I would echo, I didn't mention it in my comments, but there's still a lot of room to improve, obviously, at the border, but it's gotten better every year, and so we're making progress. But the big breakthrough is using technology, information sharing, to the extent that in our case you've got labor issues. It's not easy to run Mexican crews into the United States and vice versa. So there are lots of people involved, lots of agencies and folks involved in negotiating a good outcome and reaching a good outcome. But technology, information sharing processes are definitely a very powerful return on investment, if you will, because even with streamlined permitting processes, bridges are really expensive. And particularly if that particular stretch of the river around Laredo, Texas, where we would connect our U.S. railroad to our Mexican railroad, and again, unless you, and I know that Brownsville, Matamoros, they wanted to move that railroad out of the urban area. There's certainly desire to do that in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, but that involves massive amounts of investment and property acquisitions, which are not easy. So it's a very, very complicated, long-term, and large magnitude of the investment. Improving the processes, the information flow, combining some of the duplicative work that's done on both sides of the border, and using technology have much, much quicker paybacks.
Thank you. Mr. Leathers, building on that observation just now, we asked taxpayers to invest in bricks and mortar, which are hugely expensive costs to build a port of entry, and yet we find ourselves not utilizing that infrastructure on a 27, 24, 365 a day basis. And then we expect taxpayers to understand, well, there are lots of other problems that you have. We don't have enough CBP officers, or the Mexican customs brokers don't want to operate at certain times of the day. That isn't going to cut it, at least in my judgment. And I wonder how you would, instead of relying so much on space, whether or not, how your industry would react to the enlistment of time as well, and the utilization of congestion pricing, so that we weren't faced with peak time waits going 10, 11 hours south into Mexico, but rather would have a pricing system that let business people make choices about when exactly they needed to have their trucks online. How would you respond to that?
So you covered a lot of ground there. I'll start with this disclaimer. I'm not in the business of upsetting any customs officials. So
Either am I, actually.
I think you guys do a great job. But I will say this. So let's talk about the open hours and open times. We're in the freight business. At the end of the day, we're in the freight business. The freight business doesn't close. If you go across U.S. or Mexican carriers or Canadian carriers, we're staffed on holidays. We're staffed on Christmas. We're staffed 365 all the time, every hour. There's somebody out there working, watching, tracking, seeing, and communicating with our customers, because that's the business we signed up for. That's the business we chose to get into. You know, I talk about in our building all the time, we're in the on-time, every-time business. That is our product. It's not trucks and trailers. It's not intermodal. It's not any of this. It's on-time, every time. And that's what our business is. While many of these roles and many of these agencies and many of these people involved in this process at the border may be government employees, if you're in that aspect of the government, if you're in the part of the government, if you're in the agencies that interact with and do business with the border and the freight industry, I believe we've got to find a way to better reflect the industry itself and the industry's work hours, work times, work ethic. It doesn't mean that you don't get to ever take a vacation. It doesn't mean that you don't get your vacations off. It does mean somebody ought to be staffed and we ought to be open for business. The amount of freight crossing every day is too significant to, when you combine U.S. holidays with Mexican holidays and you put them together, it's just too much downtime. It's too much time, and it causes significant havoc across the entire supply chain, well into the interior of Mexico and well into the interior of the U.S. every time one of these holidays effects happen. So before I get into border pricing or anything else, I would just say that is something we've got to kind of come to terms with. How do we better reflect the industries with whom we're working as it relates to structuring our staffing, our hours, our open time, and our commitment to the ultimate end user, which is the customer, whether or not we work on the government side of the desk or in private industry, we ought to have better coordination. The second piece is, I agree with Pat, you know, if I'm going to invest those dollars and try to attack this problem, I like tech over, you know, physical brick and mortar, because we're underutilizing what we have today. But maybe even more than tech, it's how do we get better coordinated with the information we already have. So as an example, we've recently added 2 more inspection bays at our own private facility in Laredo, going from 8 to 10 inspection bays. We've added 2 new entry lanes at our own private facility in Laredo to accelerate, because we have to also inspect for our own purposes every piece of equipment before it goes in and every piece of equipment when it goes out. And it's a very, very thorough inspection. At what point does some of that information, our ability to convey that information and share that information, stop us from inspecting it 3 times? Us once, U.S. once, Mexico once, to just relook and reconfirm the same data that we've already checked. How do we somehow bundle that information and share that information to make it more expeditious? Now, one of the things you'll often hear in these kind of arguments is, well, that's great for the big carriers, but what about the guys that are too small to have that technology or that infrastructure? This is not a big carrier play to try to take some sort of advantage because of size and scale. Because the last time I checked, if we can eliminate some of the congestion at the border, which volume carriers would be the ones you'd want to attack to eliminate that congestion, if we could do it quicker, then it's a rising tides raises all boats moment, because everybody's congestion gets better, everybody's crossings get quicker, and everybody benefits. So there's some of that can be done. The last piece on kind of yield management or yield pricing, congestion-based pricing, we would certainly be open-minded to it. I picture, the billing nightmares of customer wants X service, but due to uncontrollable delays, we end up in Y time frame. They still want the product but don't want to pay Y rates. So it gets ugly, but I think it needs to be looked at. It's an option on the table that we should examine. But again, that would be a volume customer type. Somebody who's shipping a lot of volume is sophisticated enough to interact in that world. A lot of what we do. So we'll do, as an example, we'll approach $400 million of revenue this year. And we have exactly 3 customers in that 400 million that are bigger than 5 million. So we do a lot of business with a lot of small shippers that are really the bread and butter of both our economies. And some of those folks, it's harder to absorb variable pricing and be able to process variable pricing. But I think it should be on the table.
Yeah, so in fact, the answer to the having a 724, 365 staffing by CBP is going to require that revenue stream. I mean, there will not come a time, and we have enough people here who can confirm this, that Congress, we struggle to get enough CBP officers into the into the ports as it is. But in order to actually ensure that we have that there to coordinate with the private sector, we're going to need this revenue source. And then the question is people making choices about how important is it for them to cross during peak hours, and whether or not we can actually move that traffic as spread it across the 24-hour time frame.
Makes sense.
I would just add, related to the variable pricing, this is one of the innovative concepts that we're looking at in the design of the new Otay Mesa East facility that's being planned for the San Diego area. And the idea there is that there would be a single toll that would be, the profits would be shared between the California sponsors and the government of Mexico to go back into the port and finance the operations. But also that through ITS and other technologies, there would be signage far enough out from the port that someone could see what the toll would be to cross and what the wait times would be to make the decision which port of entry they want to try to cross at.
So this idea of binational operation, the Otay East, is on the drawing boards. No permit's been given.
They do have a permit.
Okay, they have the permit, but they don't have a design. And the idea is to actually design it so that Mexico and the United States would operate it together, so that when, depending on which hours of the day you were in, you'd reverse the lanes so they'd be going into Mexico or coming into the United States. Very innovative. The question I have, though, Hillary, is why can't we do that to solve the kinds of problems that Mr. Ottensmeyer has indicated exist currently now with the rail? Or, in fact, that Mr. Leathers indicates in terms of the inspection, so that we're not having 1, 2, 3 inspections. This idea of doing binational work doesn't have to wait to build a port of entry. But what do you see as the prospect for that kind of thing going forward?
No, I think that's exactly right. And we're trying to look at ways to do more of these joint operations. And I know some of the speakers earlier today talked both about the pre-inspection program and the unified cargo processing, the pilots that are being run from CBP, that we understand that there's a lot of support for, that they're working well and that there is a lot of support for. And I think these are some of the innovations, just unifying our binational processes, but also working with the industry participants as well to try to get as much information as people can beforehand to try to streamline once you actually get to the border.
Thanks, Ms. Quam. Let me open up the floor for questions in the time that we have left.
Thank you. Is this on? On? Yeah. I must be out of batteries. Hello? I just looked at it. That's all it takes.
Russ, identify yourself.
Okay, well, mine, if this is working,
No.
it's not.
Well,
Back there?
Why don't you go ahead?
All right,
Use the mic, it'll turn on.
I'll kind of kind of turn around and.
It's on now.
There. Whoa, yeah, God. Thank you, Alan. My name is Russ Jones. I'm chairman of the Border Trade Alliance. Thank you all for being here today. It's been very illuminating. My question is kind of a two-part, but it's related to the unified cargo processing that's becoming a new model, perhaps a new paradigm, especially when we look at how we design the ports of the future and redesign the ones we have. But in an earlier panel this morning, it was announced that FMCSA will be building up to 26 or 27 facilities all along the southern border. I didn't hear any plans to do that on the northern border, just the southern border. And in the United States, transportation highway safety is a shared responsibility with the states, unlike in Mexico. So at all of our states, whether it's TxDOT, ADOT, Caltrans, they have their inspectors and their facilities, and they all use the same standards for safety. They've all adopted those. And so it appears to me now that we're going to have both state and federal inspection facilities, and rather than having unified on the safety side, we might be going in a whole different direction. So that part of my question is going to be more directed to Derek. And then the second piece of this is, you mentioned a lack of, we don't have a dedicated source of revenues to pay for infrastructure and staffing on the borders. And that's because when we reorganized the Customs Bureau, it still was at that time, we created the merchandise processing fee, and that was ostensibly to pay for all of our staffing and all of the overtime and infrastructure we might need. Unfortunately, it went into the general fund, and no one ever saw it. So when we negotiated the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and the North American Free Trade Agreement, we negotiated that merchandise processing fee out. We weren't seeing a return on investment. But is it time to rethink that if the funds could be earmarked or dedicated towards staffing and infrastructure, and rethink that idea, because we don't have a dedicated source of funding, and it's a competitive thing that we work through the bridges and borders and the prioritization of the projects. We're all at those meetings lobbying hard for our communities, for their project, as opposed to having a dedicated source to address some of this, as well as spend money on the technology that's needed, that Derek and Patrick both mentioned. So,
Derek, why don't you take a crack at that, and then Patrick will add his.
Yeah, so I guess I'll maybe focus on the first half of that, in the interest of time. Standardized inspection protocol is something that we would love to see, even at the state level today. So while the standards are the same, the implementation of those standards is dramatically different today. So one of the biggest problems with being an interstate carrier today is how dramatically different enforcement is from one state to the next. So quick example, the state of Indiana is sort of infamous for its rigidity around certain portions of the roadside inspection. So my truck that leaves Nebraska, goes through Illinois, traverses Indiana, and ends up in Ohio, didn't fundamentally transform when it crossed the Indiana border. And it passed multiple inspections perfectly with no infractions, both before and after Indiana, but yet racks up inspection violations in Indiana at 4 times the rate of any other state. So we argue with Indiana all the time. And it's not just Indiana, but New Mexico, Indiana, there's a handful of states that are disproportionately represented. We would love to be able, and we've made this case for years, the data doesn't lie. So it's just math. If you're 4 to 5 times the percentage per mile driven in these 5 states as you are in any other state, yet we deliver over 3.5 million miles a day, the math irrefutably says there is a enforcement discrepancy in these states. That's not really disputable. It's just math. And yet we have a very difficult time getting anywhere with it. So if you then add a complexity of sort of border safety inspection stations that are maybe going to have a different set of standards and surely going to have a different set of enforcement guidelines, then it just gets even more complex. So it's an ongoing frustration. In Canada, for years and years, it's been the slack adjuster. So not to get too much in the weeds, but it's the brake slack adjuster issue. So carriers today, brakes automatically adjust through what's called an automated slack adjuster. They are in adjustment when they go into Canada. Canada consistently, it gives infractions for brakes out of adjustment. We took this up and made so much noise over this that we were going, myself personally, to inspection stations and watching the inspection and watching people use a piece of chalk bigger than my thumb to mark on the slack adjuster a violation that they would later say was 3/8 out of spec or out of it has to travel time or travel distance, and the chalk they're using is easily 7/8 in diameter. That kind of frustration is just the world we live in. We would love to see data-driven decisions where you don't debate who's right or who's wrong. You just look at the math, and it bubbles to the top clearly where these arbitrary inspectors exist who are interpreting their job, I think, a little differently than just public safety, and have become a revenue source for the state or the county or whatever where they may reside, or country in some cases.
Pat, do you want to take the merchandising processing fee?
I'll just keep it real simple, but I fortunately, the Laredo Rail Bridge is 24 hours, so we don't have that problem on our major crossing. But I think the answer to your question is without a doubt. When you think about how expensive and time-consuming infrastructure projects are, to not fully utilize them because of something that is relatively inexpensive is really, I think, borderline irresponsible. So there has to be a solution and a funding source to improve that.
We have time for one more question. Mr. Vale.
Alan, maybe this will be to you because this has to do with customs. Has anybody ever decided to really do an analysis of what skill sets you need to do different functions within customs, and maybe they don't need to have the same security requirements at every level, the same type of training at every level? I mean, you can have cargo guys, you can have guys that inspect cars, and all of those are different skills, but yet they're all cross-trained in that all the time, taking up an awful lot of resources.
Yeah, so the issue of internal workforce development, professional development, education, training, it's a fair question, but I think you have enough specialization now which accounts for some of the efficiencies that Derek identified, that can be handled by policy, Sam, rather than a question of differentiated training. This is just to say in certain areas of the monitoring mission, that certain things don't have to be done. But that's a policy issue, not a capacity or capability issue. Yes, ma'am. Let's take one more. Is that
Diana Negroponte from Woodrow Wilson. My question's for Derek Leathers. Are you anticipating driverless trucks, and what's the impact on border crossings?
I thought I might get out of this with somebody not asking for the first time ever. So autonomous technology is developing very rapidly. We see it around us in our towns. You see it in cars. We've stayed very close to it in our trucking operations. So I've spent time with the leaders of pretty much every autonomous project that's out there. I've recently driven and done ride-alongs in autonomous trucks from really anybody in the game other than Apple, who recently kind of unveiled that they're doing a lot of work in this space, and I've not visited with them yet. Do I believe the technology will come at some point and get us to a point of highly driver assist, or what they call really level 4 autonomy? So level 4 autonomy where a driver could potentially ostensibly maybe take a break or be hands off the wheel. I think that will happen. I think that's a lot further down the road than people realize. So if you're in this technology today, if you're driving around today, it works reasonably well under reasonably good weather conditions, with reasonably good markings, with reasonably good signage. But all of that is not the world we drive in today. When we drive into shippers and consignees today, the signage is not only not reasonably good, it's often directly incorrect. So it'll say arrow that way, but every driver knows they have to go over there to the dock. So there's just a lot of work to be done. Here's the good news. What is happening today, and it's absolutely making our roads safer, is the downstream effect of this quest for autonomous trucks is giving us lane departure technology that works, collision avoidance, integrated braking, adaptive cruise control. The list goes on and on and on. And since we've went 100% all in, so every single truck we've bought for the last 2+ years have had fully integrated collision mitigation devices on it, which means kind of the all of the above package. We have not had, although that's not wood, we have not had a rear end fatality accident on one of those vehicles. And so we have really two mantras. We're in the on time, every time business. And the other one is nothing we do is worth getting hurt or hurting others. And this technology is working. So I think it's a fabulous thing. We believe drivers are still going to be driving trucks. The average driver passes in his normal course of duty more live souls than any pilot in a 777 flying anywhere in the world today will have on his plane, and that's per load, per shipment, per day. Every pilot, or every plane still has a pilot. Every plane, you all got here, if you flew here, there was a pilot up front. If they had announced there wasn't, I suspect you would have departed. I don't think trucking is going to wake up in a world without it. Now, at the border, and I'm sorry for the length of the answer, at the border and at border crossings and at ports and intermodal hubs, I think that's where the real unlocked or unrealized potential of autonomy exists. Today we have, unfortunately, this perception of Mexican carrier trucks, and it's what people see in that transit operation at the border. And that's absolutely unfortunate. There are quality Mexican carriers all over Mexico. They're my friends. I've known many of them for 25 years. Their trucks are as good as the trucks we operate in the U.S. Their safety programs are as good. Their drivers oftentimes are better because the circumstances within that they have to drive. But what we see is the 15-year-old cab over, been sold 7 times, operating in a transit operation. Some of that, I think, could go autonomous and be a lot better served and a lot more environmentally friendly.
Great question, Diana. Great answer. Let me just conclude by asking Pat whether there's anything comparable in the autonomy area in the rail business.
Yeah, the rail industry in the United States is investing heavily in something called positive train control. And positive train control is focused on stopping a train where the conductor or engineer avoiding collisions, that type of thing. And it will be implemented across the industry by 2020 with interoperability among all the railroads. And there is no doubt that there is a lot of technology that is part of PTC mandate that would be useful to creating a more highly automated rail network.
Please join me in thanking a great panel discussion.
There's nothing.
Thank you, sir. Yes,
Let me invite our final panel of the day up to the stage, and we'll take a look at binational economic development.
It was a pleasure.
Really nice to see you. Thank you.